The weather report for that morning said clear skies, low wind, visibility unlimited, no precipitation expected through the weekend. It was the kind of October day that experienced hikers in the Pacific Northwest specifically wait for. After the first serious autumn rains have settled the dust, and before the snow line drops below 4,000 feet, there are sometimes weeks of cold, crystalline weather, mornings that smell of wet stone and pine resin, afternoons that hold their light longer than they should, evenings that arrive with a sharpness that makes the mountains look closer than they are. He had been waiting for exactly this window. He was 43 years old. He had been hiking these mountains since his early 20s, when he had moved to the Pacific Northwest for work and discovered, in the way some people do, that the landscape had been waiting for him. He was not a technical climber. He was not a survivalist or an extreme athlete. He was the specific kind of person the mountains produce over time. Steady, self-sufficient, unhurried, someone who had learned to read weather and terrain the way you learn a language you use every day. He knew this trail. He had hiked the 12-mile loop through old-growth forest and subalpine meadow at least a dozen times over the preceding 8 years. He knew where the trail crossed the creek. He knew the boulder field to the west of the high point. He knew the meadow. He had a favorite rock at the meadow's edge where he sometimes ate lunch before descending. He told his wife where he was going. He told her he would be back by 6 in the evening. He left his dog at home because the dog had a tender shoulder. He checked the weather one more time before leaving. Clear skies, low wind, visibility unlimited. He signed in at the trailhead at 7:14 in the morning and walked into the trees. The Pacific Northwest does something to light. At low elevations, in old-growth forest, the canopy filters what comes through into something diffused and even, not darkness, but a softening of shadow that makes the forest feel contained. Intimate in the way that large, enclosed spaces sometimes are. Sound changes too. The traffic noise from the highway below the trailhead fades quickly. Wind in the canopy is audible but distant. What you hear close up is your own footfall on the trail, the creek running somewhere below, the occasional bird call moving between trees. It is the kind of landscape that invites a particular quality of attention. Not the anxious vigilance of uncertain terrain, but a steady awareness, noticing the texture of the bark on specific trees, the way the light falls differently on north-facing slopes, the small erosion channels where rain has found its way across the trail. People who hike alone in forests like this often describe something close to meditation. The thinking mind quiets, the observing mind opens. He had been walking for about 40 minutes when he encountered the other hiker. A retired schoolteacher, walking the loop in the opposite direction, had set out from the other trailhead before dawn. She had been hiking this particular trail for years, not as frequently as he had, but consistently enough to know it in the way that comes from returning to the same place in different seasons. She described him later as relaxed, moving well, carrying a small pack which was appropriate for a day hike in October. They exchanged brief trail pleasantries, the standard acknowledgement of shared purpose that passes between solo hikers. She continued west, he continued east. That was at approximately 8:15, roughly 2.1 miles from the trailhead where he had signed in. She was the last person to see him. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Not the fact of it, The fact of a last sighting is common to all disappearance cases, but the specific quality of it. He was 2 miles in. He was on the correct trail, moving in the correct direction. The weather was exactly as forecast. He was experienced and well prepared. He was 4 miles, perhaps 3 hours of comfortable hiking, from his intended turnaround point. There was nothing wrong, and then there was nothing. The family reported him missing at 7:40 that evening, when he had not returned to his vehicle and did not answer his phone. His wife had driven to the trailhead, confirmed the car was still there, and called the county sheriff's office from the parking lot. She was calm on that call, she would say later, because she did not yet understand that calm was not what the situation warranted. She thought there was a simple explanation, a twisted ankle maybe, a longer afternoon than planned, something that would be embarrassing and funny when he got home. By 9 p.m., a search and rescue team had been deployed. By midnight, they were on the trail. SAR operations begin with structure. The initial response follows protocols developed over decades. Experienced coordinators who have run hundreds of searches know that the first hours are critical and that systematic coverage beats intuition. A subject tracker goes in first, working the trailhead and the first few miles for signs, footprints, gear on the trail, anything that suggests which direction the subject moved and whether anything changed between the trailhead and the last known position. They confirmed his footprints in soft soil near the creek crossing at mile 1. They confirmed his direction. They found nothing to suggest anything had changed. By the time first light arrived on the second day, teams were working both directions from the last confirmed sighting. The trail was swept to the high point and back down the other side. Water sources were checked. The creek, the lake at the loop's apex, the drainage gullies that cut through the subalpine terrain. The terrain on either side of the trail was swept out to 300 meters. Nothing. No gear. No sign of a fall or slip. No medical debris. No response to calls or whistles. No footprints beyond the confirmed tracks near the creek crossing. It was as if the trail had simply swallowed him. The dogs arrived on the second day. 3 experienced tracking animals, handlers who had worked wilderness searches for years. These were not detection dogs trained to find narcotics or explosives. These were air scent trackers, animals that can detect a human scent trail in open terrain and follow it across varying conditions, even hours after the subject has passed. They started at the trailhead. They located his scent without difficulty. They moved along the trail at a pace that indicated a clear scent trail, not searching, following. Past the creek crossing, past the point where he had spoken to the retired teacher, along the eastern fork, toward the high country. At mile marker 2.3, they stopped. The handlers described this stop differently in different accounts, but the core observation was the same across all 3. The dogs did not lose the scent the way they sometimes do, moving back and forth, heads down, searching for where the trail went. They stopped as if the trail had simply ended, as if the scent had ceased to exist at a specific point in space. They were brought back to the trailhead and reset, returned to the point, stopped again. A third attempt, using a different dog on a different lead, produced the same result. The handlers were experienced. They had seen dogs lose scent before: wind shifts, rain, a subject crossing water. They had various professional frameworks for unusual canine behavior in the field. One handler speaking to the search coordinator privately, said that the behavior at 2.3 was unlike anything he had seen in 14 years of SAR work. He said it several times in different ways, as if trying to find the precise language for what he was describing. He said the dogs did not seem confused. They seemed to be refusing. The coordinator noted the behavior in her report as canine assets lost subject sent at approximately mile marker 2.3, unable to reacquire. Brief, factual, appropriate. The official record moved on. She told a colleague the same evening that the dogs had not lost the scent. She said it was something different from losing. She could not describe exactly what. The helicopter sweep on the third day used thermal imaging. The theory was that if he was injured and sheltering somewhere, in a drainage gully, under the thick canopy of a specific tree, in a shallow cave or rock overhang, the thermal camera would detect the heat differential between his body and the ambient temperature. It was the right kind of cold for this to work, not warm enough for the forest floor to generate confusing thermal signatures, cold enough that a living human body would read clearly on the display. The helicopter flew a grid pattern across the entire search zone. It took several hours. The operator reviewed the footage carefully, both in the air and back at base. Nothing. No heat signature consistent with a human being in distress. This result was logged, and the grid was extended on the fourth day to cover additional terrain beyond the primary search zone. The secondary sweep found nothing either. Children do not edit the same way adults do. This is not a failure of childhood. It is its most important feature. Before the brain has fully developed its filtering apparatus, the vast unconscious machinery that decides in milliseconds what we attend to and what we discard, what we report and what we suppress, what we describe as real and what we recognize as too strange to say. Children take in the world without those decisions being made. They receive what is there. They report what they received, in the vocabulary they have, which is limited, with the translation losses that every vocabulary imposes. But without the prior decision that certain things should not be reported because they cannot be explained, this gives their testimony a specific quality. Researchers who study children's accounts of unusual experiences, and this is a legitimate field, with a legitimate body of literature in developmental psychology and in the psychology of unusual experiences, describe this quality as rawness, not in the sense of undeveloped or unsophisticated, in the sense of unprocessed, of something reported before the processing that produces the adult version has had time to happen. In the cases documented in this series, children who had unexplained wilderness experiences and who gave accounts immediately afterward, in the first hours, before adult frameworks had shaped their language, before they had learned what was and was not appropriate to say, produced accounts of a specific character. The character has been consistent enough across enough independent cases and enough time that this episode is devoted entirely to examining it, what they said, before they learned not to. The developmental psychologist, who appeared briefly in an earlier episode of this series, who said that children's testimony from these cases shares structural features with a category of experience she had only otherwise seen in one other context, and who declined to name that context on record, agreed to speak at greater length for this episode. She has spent 22 years studying how children process and report unusual experiences. Her work is grounded in developmental neuroscience and in the specific literature on children's testimony. She is not a paranormal researcher. She is a scientist who was drawn to this specific category of testimony because she found something in it that her professional frameworks had difficulty accommodating. She said, "What brings me to this research is the consistency. Children who have unusual experiences, experiences that fall outside the normal range, report them in consistent structural ways, regardless of their cultural background, their age within the developmental window I'm studying, and the specific content of the experience. The structure is more consistent than the content, which tells us something about what the structure is reflecting." She said, "In most categories of unusual child experience, the imaginary friend, the past life memory claim, the paranormal encounter, the structural features can be accounted for by known developmental processes. The brain at specific developmental stages is doing specific things that produce specific kinds of report. We understand the mechanism." She said, "In the wilderness disappearance category, in the accounts given by children who had unexplained experiences in specific wilderness terrain, there are structural features that I cannot fully account for through the developmental mechanisms I know." She said, "That's what got my attention." She said, "That's what keeps it." The first structural feature she identified is the absence of fear in the accounts, not the absence of fear in the children generally. Fear is a normal and expected emotional response in children who have been lost, who have spent time alone in wilderness terrain, who have experienced the disorientation of a disappearance. The search coordinators, the SAR personnel, the parents who described the recovery, they all described finding children who showed fear, who cried, who clung, who needed soothing. The third structural feature is the memory of place rather than the memory of event. Children in these accounts consistently remember where they were more clearly than what happened there. They can describe the terrain, the quality of the light, the specific feel of the air, the character of the environment around them, with a specificity and a precision that their accounts of the events themselves often lack. One child described years after her experience the specific quality of the moss on the north-facing slope where she had spent part of her time. She said it was the darkest green she had ever seen. She described being able to see the individual structures of it. She said it was like everything was more itself there, like things were more of what they were, like everything was more itself. She was 9 years old when she said this. She had been 7 at the time of the experience. She was using the language she had for a perception that the experience had apparently given her and that she had been carrying for 2 years. Another child described the specific sound of the water in the place where she had been, not the sound of any particular creek or lake, a quality of water sound that she had never heard in ordinary terrain, and that she tried, repeatedly, to reproduce for her parents by humming. She couldn't make it. She said, "It doesn't exist in regular places. It doesn't exist in regular places." She was 6 years old when she said this. The developmental psychologist said, "What strikes me about these descriptions is their phenomenological precision. Children at these ages are not typically good at phenomenological description, at describing the quality of experience rather than the content. But in these accounts, the phenomenological descriptions are often the most precise part. The children are struggling with the content, with what happened, with who was there, with what was communicated, but they are clear about what the experience felt like, what the place felt like. She said, "That's unusual. It suggests that what is most accessible to them is the sensory and experiential quality of the place itself, more accessible than the events, more accessible than the presence." She said, "It suggests that the place, as an environment, is primary, that what happened in it is secondary in terms of what the children were most able to hold and most able to describe." She said, "If that's right, then the terrain is the thing we should be trying to understand, not the events, not the presence, the terrain." She said, which is what the geological research in this series points toward. She said, which is not a coincidence, I'm sure what to do with. She said, "But I notice it." The fourth structural feature is the most difficult for the developmental psychologist to account for. The children in the immediate aftermath appear to have knowledge they should not have. Not knowledge in the sense of specific facts about specific events that they could not have witnessed. Knowledge in the sense of orientation, of understanding, of a relationship to the world that seems, in specific respects, more mature than the child's developmental stage predicts. She said, "I've seen this in the accounts I've studied most carefully. Children who come back from these experiences with a quality of equanimity about specific topics, about death, about continuity, about the relationship between the world we see and the world we don't, that is not characteristic of their developmental stage." She said, "A 5-year-old who has just been found after 4 days alone in wilderness terrain should, by every developmental model I know, be in a state of significant distress, should be clinging, should be frightened of the dark, of being alone, of the terrain that was their experience, should be exhibiting the behavioral markers of the significant stress they went through." She said, "In many of these accounts, they're not." She said, "They're calm. They ask for food and water with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has just finished something rather than someone who has just survived something." She said, "And in their accounts of the experience, the immediate accounts before the adult world has shaped them, they sometimes say things about where they were that reflect an understanding of it that I cannot account for through any mechanism I know." She said, "One child said, 'It's okay there. People think it isn't, but it's okay.'" She said, that child was 5 years old. She had been found after 3 days in terrain that had been searched for 3 days without finding her. She was calm and physically uninjured. She said, "People think it isn't, but it's okay." Who is people? What does think it isn't refer to? How does a 5-year-old have a framework for what people believe about the place she was? She said, "I don't know how to answer those questions through developmental psychology." She said, "I know they're real questions." She said, "Because the child said what she said, and the ranger wrote it down, before anyone had time to make it into something else. There is a man who has spent 12 years collecting the first accounts, not the accounts given later, after the adult world has had time to work on them. The accounts given in the first hours. The things written down by rangers and SAR coordinators and parents in the moments immediately following recovery. He is not a researcher in any formal sense. He is a retired librarian who became interested in the documentation practices around these cases and who has spent years tracking down the records, the intake notes, the ranger logs, the informal notes that people made when they wrote down what children said. He has compiled accounts from 63 cases spanning 4 decades, children from 3 to 12 years old, from multiple states and multiple terrain types within the documented cluster zones. He said, "What I noticed first was the consistency of the language. I'm a librarian. I've spent my career working with language. I know what language looks like when it's been processed and what it looks like when it hasn't." He said, "The first accounts are raw. They have the quality of unprocessed language. The children are reaching for words, for something they experienced, and they're using whatever is closest in their vocabulary, not the vocabulary that adults use for unusual experiences. They don't have that vocabulary yet, their own vocabulary applied as accurately as they can." He said, and across 63 cases spanning 40 years, the words that come up most often in various phrasings appropriate to various ages are nice, safe, showed, brought, here, there, beautiful, quiet, someone, not a person, but like a person. He said, "I made a list. The most common words in the first accounts across the full 63 cases." He said, "Nice, safe, showed, brought, beautiful, quiet, someone." He said, "Those are the words." He said, "A 5-year-old in Washington State in 1988 and a 9-year-old in Tennessee in 2019 used the same words." He said, "Without any contact." He said, "Without any shared framework." He said, "Using the language of early childhood." He said, "To describe the same experience, in the same terrain types, across 40 years." He said, "I don't know what that means." He said, "I know what it doesn't mean." He said, "It doesn't mean coincidence." The developmental psychologist said, near the end of her conversation with the researcher, something she had not said in any previous academic context. She said, "In 22 years of studying how children process and report experience, I have worked with children who have experienced remarkable things. Trauma, certainly, but also the remarkable things that happen at the edges of ordinary experience. The child who describes a conversation with a deceased grandparent they never met. The child who describes a memory that appears to predate their birth. The category of experience that the popular literature calls past life memories, which I approach as a research question rather than as a belief." She said, "In all of those categories, I have frameworks. Imperfect frameworks, frameworks that are contested within my field, but frameworks. Ways of understanding what the children are describing that are grounded in developmental neuroscience and in the psychology of unusual experience." She said, "In this category, the wilderness disappearance accounts, I do not have an adequate framework." She said, "Not because the accounts are unclear. They are often remarkably clear for children of the ages involved." She said, "Because what they are describing is outside the framework. It doesn't fit the developmental models. It doesn't fit the categories of unusual experience I normally work with. It has specific features that I've found nowhere else in the literature." She said, "The most unusual of those features is what I've been calling the orientation, the calm, the equanimity, the children's relationship to where they were, described in a way that is almost the opposite of traumatic." She said, "In every other category of unusual child experience I work with, The experience is described in terms of what it did to the child, what it produced in them, how it affected them. She said, in these accounts, there is a quality of what the child gave to the experience, of what the child was asked to bring, of a transaction in which the child was not simply a recipient, but a participant. She said, I've been trying to find a framework for that for a long time. She said, the closest I've found is in the accounts of what spiritual traditions describe as initiation. The child who is specifically taken into something, who is specifically shown something, who is specifically returned. She said, I'm not comfortable using that framework in an academic context. It's too loaded, too associated with frameworks I don't work in. She said, but it's the closest thing I have. She said, and I think that's significant. She said, because children don't have that framework. She said, they don't know the word initiation. She said, they just say, they showed me things, and then they come back, and they say, it's okay there, and they describe the moss, and the water sound, and the light, with the specificity of someone reporting something they actually saw in the specific terrain, where the world holds its breath, and something attends, and sometimes takes a child in, and shows them things, and brings them back, changed, in the specific direction, that these experiences always change people towards something that the researcher keeps trying to name, and that the children named first, in the only language they had. Before the world taught them to say something else, the librarian said something else. He said, I've been able, in several of the 63 cases, to track the account across time, to find the first account, the ranger's notes, the intake documentation, the parent's journal, and then to find what the person says now as an adult, to compare them. He said, the comparison is always in the same direction. The adult account is less, not less detailed, sometimes more detailed in specific ways, less raw, less specific about the things the first account was most specific about. He said, the nice one becomes an animal they thought they saw. The ones in the forest become a memory they're not sure is real. The things they showed me become something they don't talk about anymore. He said, the words shrink. The vocabulary becomes more cautious, more qualified, more appropriate to the adult world's framework for what is sayable. He said the child's account is often more precise. He said, that's not what people expect. People expect children's accounts to be confused and adult accounts to be clarified. He said, in these cases, it's the reverse. He said, the clarification goes in the wrong direction. He said, what gets clearer over time is not the account. He said, it's the editing. The developmental psychologist, when the researcher described this to her, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's consistent with what the research on unusual experience accounts shows in other contexts. The developmental trajectory of unusual experience memory is toward normalization. The brain works over time to integrate experiences that don't fit into frames that do fit. It's a healthy process. It's adaptive. She said, the cost of that process in these cases is specificity. The specific details that don't fit a frame get smoothed over. The vocabulary that was reaching for something real becomes vocabulary that describes something ordinary. She said, what the librarian is describing is the evidence of that process. He has the before and the after, and he can see what was lost in between. She said, that's important documentation. She said, because what was lost is the truest version of the account. She said, the version that came before the editing, before the world taught the child what they could and could not say, before the nice one became an animal, before the things they showed me became something not talked about, before 63 first accounts became 63 adult silences, or near silences, the silences that sit inside the edited stories, in the space where the first words used to be. There is one more account. It does not come from a child. It comes from a woman who was a child, who was 7 years old, when she had her experience in the boundary waters of Minnesota. She is the second child documented in episode 2 of this series. The one found sitting at the edge of the unnamed lake, calm, watching the surface of the water. She is in her late 30s now. She agreed for the first time to speak to a researcher. She said, "I want to say something first. I know what I said then, when I was 7. My mother kept the notes, the ranger's report, the intake form from the medical check. She gave them to me when I was in my 20s. I've read them many times." She said, "What I said at 7 is more accurate than what I can say now. That's the honest truth. I've had 30 years to think about it and to develop language and frameworks, and I still can't say it as clearly as I said it when I was 7 and didn't know what I was supposed to say." She said, "I'll try." She said, "I followed someone. That's the beginning. I woke in the night and there was someone at the edge of the lake and I followed them." She said, "It wasn't a person. I knew it wasn't a person. I wasn't afraid, which is the thing I've thought about most over 30 years. I should have been afraid. A child, alone, at a lake, in the dark, following something that isn't a person. But I wasn't." She said, "It was going somewhere specific. I understood this. It had intention. It knew where it was going, and it was willing to have me follow." She said, "I don't have memory of the time between following it and being found. 2 miles of forest," they said, "a portage trail I'd never been on. I don't remember any of it. What I remember is the beginning, the figure at the lake, and then the end, the ranger's voice, and coming back to ordinary time." She said, "In between, in the gap, I have impressions rather than memories. I have the sense of being somewhere that was very quiet and very complete. That didn't need anything from me. That was simply what it was, entirely, in a way that ordinary places aren't." She said, "I have the impression of being shown something, not told, shown. Something about—" She stopped for a long moment. She said, "About what this place is, what all of this is, this world, the way it's layered, the way there are things in it that most people don't see because they're not looking in the right direction." She said, "And I have the impression of being brought back, of something that had been with me, that had been in some relationship with me during that time, deciding it was time and returning me to the edge of that lake." She said, "With something. Whatever I was given or shown, I carried it back. I don't know what it is. I haven't been able to articulate it in 30 years." She said, "But it's there. I can feel it. Every day." She said, "And when I read what I said at 7, the ranger's notes, I can see that I was reaching for it then too, in the vocabulary of a 7-year-old. She said, "I had better words then." She said, "Or closer words." She said, "The ones I have now are more careful and further away." She said, "I wish I could give you the 7-year-old version." She said, "It was truer." She said it simply, without nostalgia, without drama. As a fact, she had arrived at, across 30 years of careful consideration. Her 7-year-old self had been truer, and the ranger had written it down, and it is still there, in the record, where first words live, before the editing begins. This is where Arc 3 comes to its close, not with answers, with the weight of 6 episodes of testimony from the people who experienced the pattern directly. The changed, the families, the SAR professionals who watched the cases accumulate, the ones who went back deliberately, and the children who said what was most true in the first hours, before they learned what could be said. The pattern across all of this testimony matches the pattern the geological and probability research produced in Arc 2. The same geography, the same terrain features, the same conditions, the same outcomes. Something is in the specific places this series has been documenting. Something that has been there long enough for indigenous traditions to encode protocols for engaging with it. Long enough for children across cluster zones to have followed it for generations and described it in the same words. Long enough for SAR professionals to build informal networks comparing the cases they cannot write officially. Something that changes the people who encounter it, not at random, in a specific direction. Arc 4 examines what that direction might mean, not through individual testimony, through the question the testimony has been building toward. What is the relationship between the people who enter these specific places and whatever is in them? What has been happening in these landscapes, and what does it mean that something has been attending to human beings in specific terrain for as long as anyone has been keeping records? The investigation continues, deeper now, into the question that all of this has been preparing us to ask.